Welcome everybody to this Farm Advisory Service webinar. We're joined this evening by Audrey Litterick, and Audrey has her own consultancy business. She's been in horticulture for 30 years, I'd say at least 30 years.
Thank you.
And very experienced, full of knowledge, grows lots of stuff at home as well. And we're also joined by Calum Johnston, and Calum is from our food and drink team. And Calum, again, very experienced and has helped set up lots of diverse businesses across the country. So we've got two really good speakers. Please just ask questions as we go along. So if you put them in the chat, and then I'll interrupt at the best moment I can. We've got quite short presentations, and we will leave plenty of time for questions at the end. So just to kick off, I have a few questions for you. So I'm going to set off a poll, and you should be able to answer on your screen. So we have we've got 3 questions in a row for you to answer. So the first question is just to find out, what stage are you at? How much experience have you got? What will you need to know this evening? So your choices are you at the spade in the ground stage, the seedling stage? Are you more of a mature shrub, or are you windblown? So if you wouldn't mind just clicking your answer, and hopefully it will come up with some guides for us. So the first question, what stage are you at? Most people are at the seedling stage. We have a couple of mature shrubs, and we have some people who are just at the spade in the ground stage. Why are you growing? Most people are both to generate income and for own use. And in testing soil, most people have never tested their soil. Some are testing every few years. Those that are testing using a home kit, and some are testing by sending to a lab. So hopefully that helps you, Calum and Audrey. Yeah. So Audrey, can I pass over to you, and we'll start by looking at soil and crop rotations and what to grow first, and then we'll come to Calum. And again, everybody, if you just want to put your questions in the chat, and I'll interrupt as we go along.
Okay, so small scale fruit and vegetable. Now this really is, it's more, the actual presentation is geared towards people that are kind of in the early stages, but what I really want to make sure is to leave enough time so that if people who are a bit more experienced and have been growing for longer and they have got questions, then we can deal with things, more complex issues, in a bit more detail later on. So we're going to be covering now site and soil, lime and fertilizers, whether to be growing indoors or outdoors, what to grow, crop rotations, and a few specific points about polytunnels. Not everybody has got a choice about what site they're going to be using. Some people have got very limited choice, but if you do, if you do have a choice, it's ideal, obviously, where possible, to use a sheltered site, and ideally south-facing slope, which is not too high above sea level. But I'm managing at about 160 meters above sea level, and I know a lot of people that are higher than that and can do quite well. If you don't have the perfect south-facing calm site, which most people don't, you can certainly look at erecting windbreaks to protect your crops from the wind. And also, I would say wherever you are, whatever you're doing, given the Scottish weather, and this January, February, March for us has been horrendous, very unpredictable, consider putting up some form of protection, particularly a polytunnel of some sort, or at least a small glasshouse to do your early propagation. What you're trying to do, if you're trying to make some money out of your growing, very much you want to be looking at extending the season. Okay, next slide. And then the next thing that you want to be doing is looking at your soil. And for most people, you're not going to be importing soils. You're going to be making the best of what you've got and trying to make that soil into something that's capable of being as fertile as possible and being a good base for growing your crops in. So I'm going to say a bit more about soil at the moment, because I know quite a few really quite experienced growers who are growing good crops, but they're not thinking quite as hard about their soils as they might, and they could perhaps be getting better yields or better crop quality. So the soil properties fall into three types: physical properties, chemical properties, and biological. And that sounds quite scientific, but it's really very, very basic. So soil physics is all about what the soil feels like, and physical properties are really important. So a physically healthy soil will be soft enough to allow the roots and the water and the air to move around in the soil. So it's important to have a good dig around in the area that you're going to be starting with, or have a dig around in the areas that you're already growing in, and think about what your soil actually feels like and smells like. Are the lumps of soil easily broken up, or are they hard and difficult to break? And sometimes actually over cultivation is a cause of problems as well, where your soil doesn't have much of a structure. That could be problematic too. Next slide, please, Siobhan. So one of the first things you ought to be doing is looking to try and eliminate any compacted areas. And you can get compaction at any depth. You can get compaction right in the top surface. And in fact, even tiny little things like hens, poultry can cause some of the worst soil compaction just in the very, very top layers in wet weather. Or heavier animals can cause problems with the layers lower down, or machinery, for example. So it's quite common to get a plough pan, in other words, a compacted layer at the bottom of where the plough or the rotavator is working. And in some cases, if you can find that, identify it, it's good to break it up every now and again. But you should, once you've got the hard lumps broken up, you should then be looking to minimise cultivations where possible. So that's called minimum tillage, or even some people go down the route of permaculture, where you're basically hardly ever cultivating the soil at all. The other thing is about looks to your soil. If the soil looks pale, it might be lacking in organic matter. So you should always be prepared to add plenty of bulky organic fertilizers, things like compost and dung, to try and build up the organic matter, and therefore build a good home for all the organisms that like to live in soil, not counting the plants or the crops that you're trying to grow, but things like the bigger ones that you can see, like earthworms being the number one, springtails, mites, collembolans, and all the little microorganisms that you can't see as well. So you should aim to have a depth of at least, for horticultural cropping, ideally at least 30 centimetres of good friable soil. And for some crops, like the root crops like carrots, even more is good. Next slide, please. And then let's look at the fertility, or the chemistry of the soil, if you like. Is there any nutrients in there? Is it fertile? Soil fertility is the ability of soils to grow crops, basically, to grow good yields of healthy crops. And crops need a wide range of nutrients in the right balance. In other words, they need lots of some nutrients and tiny amounts of other nutrients. So they need a lot of nitrogen, quite a lot of phosphate and potash as well, fair amounts of sulfur and magnesium, and then lots of tiny amounts of trace elements, multiple trace elements. But how do you know that your soil's fertile? Well, the only way to be really sure is to test it. Now, I know some very good growers who've not yet tested their soils. Excuse me, but it's a bit risky. It's a bit risky to do that, because what works for perhaps one generation of growers in a particular area of ground might not work for the next generation. And that's because if the soil has been really poor and they've been adding lots and lots of dung or lots of compost, for example, to keep doing that quite often isn't a good idea at those heavy rates, because you can end up with problems. Nutrient imbalances, or far too much of one nutrient in the soil, which can cause quite serious problems. So I would say it's very important to test your soil. Next slide, please, Siobhan. So when you're testing, you should be sampling the soil by walking across your plot in a W pattern and then taking about 10 to 15 small trowelfuls, or ideally an auger, which takes a sort of core, if you like, right down to about 20 centimetre depth. Put it in a bucket, mix it all together, and then usually you send about 300 grams off to a lab. I would heartily recommend sending your soil to a lab. It's not particularly expensive, and you might need to get help interpreting the results, but it's a lot more accurate than just guessing what state your soil's in, just guessing how fertile it is, or doing the little home test kits, which are not bad, but they're not as good as sending it to a lab. Next slide, please. So what to actually test for is not much. If you're suspecting your soil's contaminated for any reason, like, for example, it's been near any form of vehicle depot or something like that, there's been old tractors sitting there, maybe it's worth testing for other things. But under normal circumstances, soil pH, which is a measure of soil acidity and alkalinity, soil pH, plant available major and secondary nutrients, phosphorus, potassium, and magnesium. P, K, and magnesium, column. You might want to test for trace elements, but not normally. Next slide, please. But soil pH is very, very important. It affects plant growth indirectly, and I think I tested about 20 soils, or rather soils from about 20 crofts in Lewis a few years back, and some were way below what they should have been. pH 5.5, much too low. A few were perfect, and a few were way too high. So some people hadn't been adding any lime at all, and some people had been adding far too much. It's really important to get that right, because pH affects plant growth indirectly by influencing the availability of quite a lot of nutrients, particularly phosphorus and trace elements, and also toxic ions like aluminium. If the soil pH isn't right, the availability of those nutrients will also be reduced. So what you should be looking to do is keep your pH about 6.5, never below 6, and ideally not above 7, with one or two exceptions, which I can go into if anybody asks questions. So what you're trying to do is create soils which are fertile enough to grow the crops that you want. So when you get your soil test results back, you should be aiming to have your P status and your K status in the upper part of the moderate range. And that the laboratory will identify that for you, where your soil is in terms of that range. It's acceptable to be high, but it's best to be in the upper part of the moderate range for P and K, and magnesium status should be moderate on the Scottish scale or the SAC scale. And there should be sufficient other nutrients for healthy crop growth. Nitrogen is different. You don't test for nitrogen, which is a major plant nutrient, possibly one of the most important, probably one of the most important nutrients. You can't test for that as such. Again, that's quite a complicated thing to get your head around, but you have to estimate how much nitrogen is in your soil based on how much of the compost and dungs you put on and what your past cropping has been. So that's maybe a subject for questioning later on, if anybody is interested in that. Next slide, please. So you should be planning ahead every year to make sure that you've got enough nutrients in the soil to allow the crops to thrive in year one and then every year after. So you don't need to necessarily put all your fertilizers on every year to help every crop. You can be thinking in terms of a rotation. So have I got enough to satisfy the crops in the next in the whole rotation, for example? And that's normally the way that I think as a organic grower. Organic growers mostly think quite well in advance, and they apply organic fertilizers which gradually break down and supply crops with nutrients. Most people on this call probably won't be using synthetic fertilizers in the form of ammonium nitrate and sulfate of potash and things like that. Neither do I. It's perfectly possible to grow really good crops. In fact, I would say it's much better. And there's a bit of evidence coming out now which shows that the microbiology in soils is much better at helping your crops to yield well and grow well, where you're having to work them hard, and you're not applying synthetic fertilizers. Next slide, please.
Audrey, before you do that, can I go back a couple of stages? Somebody's asking about samples, soil samples for analysis. Where do they send them? And then also, if they're going to SEC, where they find the form. So where should they send samples to?
Well, in Scotland, I think probably SAC is one of the best. I mean, there are other labs. If I've got huge volumes of samples, I send them to a company called NRM, which is also very good. I would say NRM and SAC are probably about the same price, and it takes usually between a week and 2 weeks to get your results back. I think, as far as SAC is concerned, the sample submission forms are actually on the internet. Is that correct, Siobhan?
They will be. In fact, I can send out a link when I'll send out a link to talks, and I'll send the form on there as well. So it's either that or take them to, if you're near a SEC office and you take it to the office, it saves you the cost of postage. That's my top tip. But otherwise, you can just send them off yourself.
And I can't remember. I mean, I get a cheaper price because I send hundreds of soil samples off on a monthly basis. So I'm not sure what the fee is either for. It's not that expensive. It'll probably be about £16 or something.
That's all right.
Yeah, I think it's about, I think a single sample is now 25 for routine, for pH, P and K.
Yeah, of course, as a business, I'm not paying the VAT element.
But the more you send, the cheaper it is.
Cheaper it is, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, and I have another question for you, which just before you move on too much, which someone is asking, can you talk a bit more about the friable depth? They were surprised it needs to be 50 centimeters ideally.
No, not 50 centimeters ideally. 20 centimeters is kind of what I would say is a minimum if you're wanting to grow root crops.
Okay.
Depends on what you're trying to grow. If you're just wanting to grow like salad crops and things with very shallow roots, you can do with about 10 centimeters or so. But if you're if you're wanting a rotation, including things like carrot crops and parsnips, they need quite a depth of soil to be able to do good. I mean, I've grown in as little as about 15 and managed to get fairly reasonable yields of a lot of stuff. And then I moved to Highland Perthshire, where my soils are about 2 meters, 2.5 meters deep of silty, very beautiful silty clay loam, and I can grow carrots about 1 foot long. So it does make a difference. Not just the depth of soil, but the depth of soil which remains well drained in the wet spells. That's actually quite important as well. So it doesn't have to be 50 by any means. I don't know many people who've got soil depth like that. But I would say for a good rotation with decent yield, you're looking at least 20 and ideally 30.
Grand, thank you.
Okay. Right, next slide. So you'll be using your soil test results to assess whether you need to apply lime, and SAC actually give you a lime requirement with the results, so they're telling you how much lime to apply. You might need a bit help with how to choose your fertilizers, and by fertilizers I mean not necessarily something out of a bag, but fertilizers also includes things like composts and dung and so on. How much to put on of those, although there are some really good rules which I'll mention, because it's a bit more there's a bit more feel for it rather than strictly setting particular amounts to apply with dung and compost. It's easier in a way. It's easier in many ways, but you might need to seek help to interpret and act on the results of these soil analysis coming back from the lab. Next slide, please, Siobhan. So a very good start for any new fruit or veg growing area would be to apply dung or garden compost, and actually strawy cattle manure and stable manure and green compost or garden compost they are remarkably similar in terms of their nutrient content, in terms of the amount of N, P, and K that's in them. They're actually very, very similar. So you'd be looking to put about, I speak in both camps, so sort of 30 to 60 tonnes per hectare, or that is equivalent to about 3 to 6 kilograms per square metre. So it's the same amount. In some cases, you could go up to 100 tonnes per hectare or 10 kilograms per metre squared if you're looking at a very nutrient impoverished site, but I'd probably not go on it any more than that. And you definitely could not keep applying that year on year, or you would run into a situation where your soils were extremely high in phosphate. And that's not a good thing environmentally under any circumstances. It's very polluting potentially, especially if you need a burn or a ditch or whatever. And also, if your soils are too high in phosphate, then it blocks the uptake of some nutrients like zinc, for example, or iron. Now, I've got that in my garden. It wasn't me that did it. My garden was a former piggery, and the soils are very phosphate enriched. And I really do see, especially in a cold spring, how zinc deficient and how iron deficient my crops are. And I'm permanently on iron and zinc supplements because of that. So because we're pretty much self-sufficient in vegetables. So you do not want to create a soil which has got nutrient imbalances in it. So don't, it's a very complicated subject. I'm simplifying it here, but don't over apply compost and dung. In future, probably once your soil is at the right, once it's at and the upper part of moderate for P and the upper part of moderate for K, then you're only looking to put on about 2 to 4 kilograms per square metre or 20 to 40 tonnes per hectare of compost or dung every year in your rotation, but not where you're growing peas or carrots. And most crops, other than peas and beans, will need some additional nitrogen in some form. So if you put on enough dung to satisfy the crop's needs for nitrogen, you're putting on too much P and K. So you'll have to pull back on the solid manures a bit and find some other way of getting nitrogen. And there's various ways of doing that. Okay, I'm just going to say something briefly about outdoors and indoors. I would say if you're looking to make money out of growing crops, you want to be doing both indoor and outdoor cropping. And in Scotland, you really do need to extend the season. And the best way to do that is to have a polytunnel and possibly some cloches and some fleece. Use it to warm the soil and use it to extend the season in both directions. And a polytunnel can help you to produce crops pretty much all year round. I've certainly got some people near me who are able to sell stuff 12 months of the year because they've got a polytunnel and they could not do it otherwise. It also enables you to produce some slightly more exotic things like tomatoes and cucumbers reliably and butternut squash, for example. Next slide, please. So what to actually grow? Well, I'm talking here about vegetables, salads, things like some of the easier ones would be things like potatoes, courgettes in a good summer. They're not necessarily easy in a wet summer. And then some of the more difficult ones, potentially cauliflowers, for example, sweet corn. Lots of options. Basically, the more variety you have, probably the better chance you have of preventing pests and diseases, because nature abhors a monoculture, and and that's why we have so many pests and diseases in our modern farming systems, because they're not nearly diverse enough. There's far too many monocultures. And small-scale horticulture, you have the advantage because you can grow lots of different things in a relatively small space. So the other thing is, don't forget herbs, top and soft fruit. So by that I mean apples, pears, maybe if you're very adventurous, plums and cherries. Soft fruit, things like blueberries particularly can be a very lucrative crop. Raspberries, strawberries, ornamentals even as well, and some of the native trees can be part of horticultural enterprises. Next slide, please. So if you're If you're new to it, I would say try easier or faster growing things first. So potatoes are a good choice. Potatoes are particularly good where you want to clear ground, but you're not wanting to go down the route of using herbicides to clear that ground. So a mixture of a bit of digging, a bit of rotivation, and also potatoes can help clear your ground as the first crop in your rotation, which is what I did in my new areas of land. And then some of the leafy salads are also good as well, because they're very fast growing, and you can grow them in a polytunnel pretty much all year round in succession. Try to grow those that you know you're going to be able to either use yourself or sell readily. And nobody is an expert on any one crop when they try it the first time. Even when you're growing it in a new area to you, new to you, or a new site or new soil, a crop that you've grown before can throw up lots of new challenges. So it's really important to actually read up on the crops that you're going to grow, on the internet or also in books. Find out who locally around you is growing particular things. And I find that most gardeners or growers are quite keen to share their knowledge. Next slide, please. One of the most important things that you need to know, though, and this is an absolutely golden rule, you must rotate your crops. Whatever you plan to grow, you must rotate your crops. From my point of view, even the tiniest area should have a crop rotation in it. So my glasshouse is only, I think, 12 feet long by 6. And it's got a 4-course crop rotation in it. So it's got, I think it's tomatoes, followed by cucumbers, followed by peas and beans, followed by salads, which has got brassicas and lettuce in it. And the advantage of that is it helps the different crops use nutrients in different ways, and also they're all susceptible to slightly different sorts of pests and diseases. And crop rotation is the main way to prevent pest and disease problems, but also it can help reduce weed problems as well, because some crops are dreadful for weeds. It's my onions that are the worst. Not because it's mainly because onions leave a little bit of space between them, the way that I grow them, and the weeds love that space. And also because I'm not very good at getting in there and weeding them when I should. So the weeds always build up in my leeks and onions, and then I can control them again in the potato year or the brassica year, for example. And growing different crops in the one area of soil also helps to protect soil structure, because some crops like potatoes, where you're doing a lot of digging, typically, not everybody does, but most people do, then that's not great for soil structure. Whereas other crops that you're not digging so much for, or not digging at all, gives the soil a chance to recover. Next slide, please. So I would suggest is dig your, I think that's probably my greenhouse. So I would suggest dividing your outdoor areas and your polytunnel and your small greenhouse into at least 4, although ideally 5 or 6, and try and keep the areas genuinely separate. So there should actually be a barrier between each one, and you should try and avoid spreading soil between each one where possible as well. And grow each plant family no more than once every 3 years, but ideally no more than every 4 to 6 years, even in a tunnel. I've seen some really dreadful problems with very good growers saying, well, we've never had a problem with disease, and we've grown this crop or that crop every year in that tunnel for yonks. And then suddenly there is a problem. And once you do have a problem, it's very difficult to sort it once you've got a problem, because you're organic. I would imagine most people here don't want to use pesticides. I certainly don't. And sorting out a problem once it's happened can be very, very difficult. So by rotating, you'll reduce the chances of serious soil-borne pests and diseases. Crop rotation can't help you prevent every disease. It can't prevent airborne disease or airborne pests, but it can help with the soil-borne ones. Next slide, please. So there's 8, thinking about crop rotations, there's 8 main vegetable families. So the cabbagey type things, the brassicas, kales, cabbages, collies, broccoli, sprouts. And there's the alliums, very different, all the onions, garlics, and spring onions and leeks. And then the cucumbers, which of course doesn't just include cucumbers, but also things like pumpkins and marrows and courgettes. Legumes, that's all the things that fix their own nitrogen from the soil, and you never need to give those things nitrogen. Things like peas and beans, and the non-cropping ones that you might put in as a green manure, things like clovers, crimson clover, vetches. And then there's beetroots, things like chard and spinach is also in the beet family. And then the lettuce, which is not just the lettucey type things, but also artichokes and chicory. Potatoes, potato family can be a bit problematic in that when you're looking to do a rotation in a greenhouse, you might want to grow peppers, tomatoes, and aubergines, but they're all in the one family. So that means that, and a lot of people want to fill their whole greenhouse with that, or their whole polytunnels with tomatoes, aubergines, and peppers, but you've got to be careful because they're all the same family as this potato. And then there's the carrot family as well, which is carrots and parsnips, but also the lesser grown ones, such as celery and parsley and the herb fennel. So you should be looking to combine crops with similar needs in the same rotation block. So the things that don't need much nitrogen can go well together. So for example, peas, beans, and carrots. I've got in mine, I think, broad beans, French beans, runner beans, and sugar snap peas and ordinary peas, and all the carrots in one bed. And those that need net covers of a similar type might be best together. So I've got all my brassicas protected, all in the same bed. Next slide, please. There's a few key rules. It's quite a big subject, this, but there's a few key rules that you should know. Never put any lime before potatoes. So if you've got a 4-year crop rotation like I do, because I've not got that big a garden, your lime should go on before the brassicas because they like it. And by liming to pH 5, you're liming to a compromise, really, because some crops like more acid conditions than that, and some like a bit more alkaline, and the brassicas quite like it 6.5 to 7.5, really. So lime before the brassicas, never before the potatoes, because it makes the potatoes covered in scab. You should also grow nutrient-demanding crops like potatoes and brassicas immediately after big applications of dung or compost, and then try and keep peas and beans as far away from that as possible, and carrots as well. And some of the crops you can grow, although you'll call it a year where you're growing maybe lettuces, you don't just have one crop, obviously. With the brassica and lettuce salads, you can have 2 or 3 crops, or even 4 in the 1 year. And you should try and never leave the soil bare. That's one of the principal rules of modern regenerative farming, and it certainly works for horticulture as well. Okay, nearly at the end here. Next slide. The other thing about horticulture in general, it can work really well as a partial income, because it can complement your other job or your other jobs, either outside your farm or croft or on your farm or croft. So it's important to try to choose crops which are harvested away from the peak times in your other job, whether that might be lambing or calving or silage harvest or whatever. It's especially possible to do that usually with polytunnels. But you can make the cropping as simple or as complex as you want. I mean, I know one person that doesn't grow anything else except blueberries, but he's got blueberries on a reasonable scale, and that fits with his other work. But I know Calum's going to talk a bit more about markets and things later. So take-home messages at the end there, Siobhan. So it's worth choosing the best site that you can on your farm with care, and certainly consider windbreaks. Particularly, I've seen the death of 2 polytunnels local to me this year, and neither of them had windbreaks. And polytunnels sometimes can last through a couple of winters, and then you then realise, oh, should have had a windbreak. Definitely worth assessing your soil it's your gold dust. It's the most important thing on your farm or croft, without a doubt. It's certainly worth testing it to find out what's in there and what you need to do to make the best of it. And choose the crops which are, and do get help interpreting the results if you don't know how to do that. It can be a bit complicated, particularly if you haven't had results from a lab before. And choose crops which are liable to work for you. And if you don't know what that is, you have to go on a fact-finding mission to see what's growing well locally with other growers. Definitely implement a crop rotation. It's vital. There's lots of information on the SRUC website, all the FAS publications, which can help you further. I think that's all for me.
Great, thank you very much, Audrey. And there's also, of course, the SCF horticulture book, the horticulture handbook. That's really good as well. Okay, that's really good. There's quite a few questions have come in. So first, does applying seaweed affect the pH of the soil?
Not at all. It's not. You brought up a very good point for two reasons. Seaweed is it's a great fertilizer. There's lots of different types, but again, it's remarkably similar to dung in terms of its P and K content. It's got quite a lot of nitrogen too. It's got lots of trace elements, so it's a very good, healthy thing to apply to your soil. In the wet west of Scotland, personally, I don't really think it matters when you apply it, but you're absolutely right to think, does it affect the pH of the soil? It might very, very slightly reduce it over time, because whenever you add a nitrogen fertilizer to the soil, it does gradually reduce it over time. Certainly won't lime it, but you're absolutely right to think, is the material I'm applying, will it affect the pH of the soil? And some things do. So mushroom compost is some people have access to mushroom compost, and it has a very strong liming value, which is a good thing if you need lime, but it's a really bad thing if you don't need lime. The other thing which some people are applying now is ash from their fire or their biomass boiler or whatever. Some people are adding it to their compost heap or their dung heap. I'm not saying don't. What I am saying is be very wary, because it's got lots of P and K in it, which is great, but it's an extremely powerful liming agent. Again, usually, but not always. So my granny always used to put ash from her from her fire on her ground, and I think in small quantities it's a good thing. Certainly she had lots and lots of P and K in her ground, but her pH must have been very, very high. It must have been. So it's not something never to do. I wouldn't do it if you've got if you're burning coal or anthracite or something like that, because you might get more than you bargained for. But wood ash is fine, but I certainly wouldn't do it for more than a few years, because your pH will get too high. So you should always think about neutralizing value or liming value in the bulky materials that you apply. But you won't get a liming effect from seaweed or from compost. Well, not much, or from dung, but you might if you add some ash to it. And mushroom compost is a yes too. That's a liming agent.
Okay. And what do you think of products like rock dust, Remin, for example?
Yeah. I've done a lot of work on rock dust. In most situations, I don't think it's worth the money. It does contain trace elements. It does contain some phosphate. I think if you're applying it at very, very high rates, 100 tons per hectare plus, in other words, 10 kilograms per square meter plus, if you're applying it at that to a soil which is very, very impoverished, then you can do, there is a slight increase in yield. I've done a lot of work on this, and science work with replicated trials, and I don't believe it's generally worth the money. I know it's touted as having lots of trace elements and magical things about it. But if you really need a trace element, then the best thing to do is test your soil, look for any problems with the trace elements, and apply that trace element. It's an awful lot cheaper and an awful lot less effort. The one thing that I'm looking at it on a very big scale for at the moment in land restoration, where we are putting on about 600 tonnes per hectare, between 100 and 600 in trials, there's evidence that it can sequester inorganic carbon, and that's beyond doubt. That's the science is there. But whether you want to be bothering with that, that's no interest to you as crofters, I would say, to do that on a small scale, and it's going to cost a fortune. And increasingly, I'm worried about that from a whole carbon footprint point of view, because we don't want to be shifting 600 tonnes per hectare of rock around the country because it's very heavy on diesel. So from that point of view, the inorganic carbon sequestration point of view, I wouldn't bother. And from the crop health point of view, my opinion is the science doesn't stack up.
Okay. Would you recommend to include 1 year of rest or green manure in your crop rotation?
It's a good idea if you've got enough space. And if you're certified organic, you kind of have to do that. Because you won't be able to get enough nitrogen in the system easily, and you won't really be able to satisfy the organic principles if you don't do that. You can get off with it, particularly in polytunnels where space is expensive. There is such a thing as a stockless rotation where you're supplying all the fertility in the form of legumes and short-term legumes, and also compost and manures and seaweeds and stuff. But it's ethically and organically more desirable, I would say, to have a year where you're not doing anything. It's very good for the soil as well. It's very good for the beasties in the soil, particularly if you're doing lots of cultivations for things like potatoes and carrots. I must admit I don't. And the reason is really I'm not certified organic. I'm not trying to follow strict rules, and I don't have enough space. And lots of weird smaller growers feel that it's a step too far. I do use green manures though, and I also grow quite a lot of weeds, which is not a bad thing, providing you don't let the weeds produce lots and lots of seed, which sometimes I do, and then I just create more problems for myself. So weeds can be actually a very good green manure, providing you don't let them get out of hand. I don't mean perennial weeds, but annual. I mean, chickweed I regard that as a friend, really, because it soaks up a lot of the nitrogen that's left around at the end of the season, hangs onto it until the spring, and then I dig it in before it starts going mad. But the ideal would be to have a leguminous green manure. I've done it once or twice with crimson clover, which establishes quite quickly if you can get it in early enough, and then that's quite good. But ideally, yes.
That allowing weeds just sounds like an excuse to me. But anyway, so when you say about not growing in the same polytunnel for more than 5 years, do you mean not in the same bed in the polytunnel?
Yes, I do. Yes, yes. Oh, it's fine to have it in the same polytunnel, but not in the same bed. And I do try to actually have a barrier, a genuine barrier. So I've just got wooden, I suppose, big planks that go down to about 8 inches between the different beds in my glass house or polytunnel, and try to stop soil moving between them.
Okay. And someone is asking, can you please suggest a cover crop to help put fibre into the soil? What they have is an old cow shed dump over the years, so it's very fertile, but stays wet and has lots of lost wellies in it.
Well, I would say I wouldn't choose a single species. I think the magical cover crops all have 4 or 5 species in them, and I would be choosing something that had a deep rooter, something like one of the big radishes, the big sort of oil radishy type things, and a legume like vetch, maybe 2 legumes, vetch and clover, for example, and maybe something like Hungarian rye. So and things, 5 different species that all have slightly different rooting patterns. Some are nitrogen fixers and some are not. Some are very fast growing and some are not. I would never, it's complicated. There's lots of other little rules that I have as well. Like if you've got clubroot, which is one of the most awful brassica diseases, unfortunately I do, nothing to do with my fault, but it was the previous landowner. If you've got clubroot, which is a brassica disease, I would never include a brassica in the mixture. So there's other, and you maybe don't need a pan buster. If you've got light soils, you maybe don't need one of the deep rooting things like oil radish. So horses for courses, but I would always have a fast grower, ideally probably something like mustard. Mustard is also good because when it grows up and you plough it in or dig it in or whatever, it's got a bit of a sort of soil sterilant effect. It can actually help reduce numbers of nematodes and plant pests. So I would go for a 5-species mixture, and there's no hard and fast rule on exactly what to have in it. But if you go to a company like Cotswold Seeds or some of the other seed companies, they can advise on the best mix for your particular soil and your particular situation.
Okay, thank you very much. That's great. We've got one last question, and then we'll hand over to Calum, and then we'll take any more questions at the end. But this one's for you, Audrey. So, no dig techniques. Would you plant on compost, or would you suggest you still need to dig and deal with weeds or cover?
Well, I'm just moving over to no dig now, where possible, but it's not, I'm not a pure permaculture person. I've never got permaculture to work as well as the real experts do. And I'm fussy as far as yields are concerned. And I just don't get, on my soils, I can't get the yields with root crops that I want. And my husband eats a lot of potatoes. So I want really good yields of potatoes. So I dig for potatoes, and I dig for the other root crops like parsnips and carrots. We don't dig for other things. So what we do is we apply the compost so I've got a 4-year rotation, grow far more than 4 different types of crops, but we've got mixtures of crops in every bed. And we just apply compost to the surface and then plant through it. Or we sow with compost on either side and then fold the compost in and around the seedlings once the seedlings get a bit older. So I'm definitely trying to minimize the amount of digging, and it's absolutely fine for the compost to be put onto the top because the worms will do the work. If it's a healthy soil, then there should be worms in there and the worms will do the work. The other thing that I'm trying to do increasingly, by mistake this year, I ordered far too much strulch. I've got another garden which is ornamental and fruit gardens and stuff. By mistake this year, I ordered too much strulch because I was cross because the price had gone up per bag, but I didn't notice that the bags were now 20 kilos rather than 9 or something like that. So I ordered far too much. And this year, what I've been doing is where the soil is bare and I've not got compost on it, or I don't want to put on that much compost, I'm covering the soil in this strulch stuff. But I know various people who are cutting grass, not grass that has set seed, but grass, lawn clippings or wildflower meadow clippings, and putting that to cover the soil where you're not digging, because that massively helps. So the weeding gets cut if you do that. The weeds just don't get such a chance. So that has a massive impact as well, this mulching roundabout growing crops.
Great stuff. Thank you. So people are still putting some questions in, which we'll come to at the end. But now I think we can pass over to Calum, since a few people are growing not just for home produce, but also for selling or thinking about it. So it'd be great to hear you on that subject, Calum.
Yeah, thanks very much. Siobhan, can you see my screen? Is that working okay?
I can indeed, yes.
Good stuff. Yep. Yeah, thanks, Siobhan, and also thanks, Audrey. Really interesting stuff. So, hi everyone, I'm Calum Johnston. I work alongside Siobhan for SEC Consulting. I work in the Food and Enterprise team. So a lot of my work is centres around supporting farmers, crofters, and smallholders with diversification, and also tourism-based activities. Now, I'm aware that marketing, or the concept of marketing, often isn't at the forefront of farmers and growers' minds. After all, you're far more interested in just growing the crop, which is great. So what I'm going to do tonight is, rather than focus on some marketing concepts, is what I want to do is really highlight the key things that you need to know if you want to upscale, if you want to sell your produce commercially, okay? So probably 15 to 20 minutes. If you've got time to stay on, that'd be great. I'm going to cover where to start, setting up a commercial food business, market research. I'll touch on budgeting, and then I'll close out with community-supported agriculture schemes. So I think, for me, the first question that you really should ask yourself is, are you growing produce for your own consumption, for family and friends, or direct sales via like an honesty box at the end of the farm road or the end of the croft road? Or are you looking to set up a commercial business which sells produce regularly to other businesses, be it cafes, restaurants, hotels, and consumers? Now, the reason I ask this is because there is a difference between domestic use and setting up a commercial food business, which I'll explain. So I think this is really the starting point, is to identify your goals and what you're aiming to achieve. Now, I'm not here tonight to put you off starting a commercial business, and would very much encourage you to do so if that is your ambition. I think it's just quite important to recognise that if you do want to upscale and sell commercially, there are legislative and also supply chain challenges that you may face as a very small producer. But saying that, it is easy enough to grow domestically for yourself, for domestic purposes, your family and your friends, okay? But tonight, I'm going to focus on starting a commercial business. If you are very small, if you're growing small quantities of produce domestically for your own consumption, for your family and friends, let's say on the croft, you've got a few hens and you want to sell eggs, and you've got some veg that you want to sell to family and friends, you don't need environmental health and you don't need to register as a food business. Although it is advisable to put some health and safety guidelines on produce. So if you're selling, say, raw veg, or if you're selling eggs, put on the box, or put on something like wash before use. It's advisory, but it's not legislative. In some circumstances, if you're selling small volumes of fruit and veg to a local restaurant, then you don't need to register as a food business, but you must still abide by an obligation for that restaurant or hotel to supply safe food. And you also have to maintain traceability requirements. So this only applies to small volumes. Now, I spent a bit of time in preparation for this. I contacted Environmental Health because I was like, well, I asked the question, what is small volumes? What is that? What does it mean? And what they said to me is actually quite vague. So the term small quantities and small volumes is quite vague. So the general advice is, if you're doing it ad hoc on a small basis, is contact your local authority first before you do so. If you intend to scale up and sell commercially, so selling regularly to other businesses, or selling veg boxes on, say, a weekly or fortnightly basis to consumers in the local village or local town, then there are legislative factors that you would need to comply with. So you would need to register. So all commercial food businesses must register with your local environmental health service, and you must do this at least 28 days, 1 month before you start trading. Registration is free and it applies to all types of food businesses. So whether you grow produce, whether you're cooking it, you're selling it, storing it, handling it, even if you're distributing food on a commercial basis, you must register. It's likely that at that stage, your environmental health officer will come out and give you a visit. They're there to help you through the process, and it's generally advised to get in touch with them early, well in advance. 28 days is the minimum. I would recommend, quite a few months before you start trading. I often think about environmental health in a similar vein to planners. If you get in contact early and you talk them through what you're thinking of doing and you ask them for their help, then generally it gets you on the right foot, and it's a more positive conversation. So just give them a phone and ask for their help. A few other things to think about. If you're selling commercially, you need to comply with health and safety and food hygiene requirements. If you are planning to have staff or even volunteers, you must comply with health and safety. For example, having dedicated hand washing areas. If you're picking fruit and veg that is for human consumption, if you're preparing veg boxes, then you need to provide hand washing facilities. You'd be very surprised how many people go to the toilet and don't wash their hands. So you must provide hand washing facilities. Selling commercially, if you think about labeling, so labeling goes beyond just a brand logo or an image on the front of packaging. If you're selling commercially on a regular basis, you must specify the product. You must specify any certification. Audrey mentioned organic earlier. So if you're organic, you're just selling for, if you're just using it for domestic use, that's absolutely fine. You don't need to worry about it. But if you are selling regularly and you're selling commercially, you must have the certification and the paperwork to go with it. Otherwise, it devalues those producers that are actually organic and have worked very hard to become organic. Weights, just to touch on weights. So if you're selling commercially, if you're, say, selling 350 grams or a kilogram of a product, you need to ensure that the weights are accurate, so that your weights are calibrated properly. Otherwise, you could be mis-selling, over or under to the end customer. What else? Record keeping, very similar to farming and crofting, pesticide records, traceability, things like management procedures like pest control, storage of chemicals, who's got access to it, are they qualified? There's all these things to think about if you're selling commercially. So that's quite boring, if I'm perfectly honest. But it's important to sort of recognize that if you do want to upscale from a domestic purpose to a commercial purpose, there's all these things to think about. So that's boring stuff out the way. Let's move on. Another thing to think about is if you're selling commercially, is to do market research. Okay, it's important to understand your target audience. Who are your customers? Okay, who are they? Where are they based? Geographically, how far away are you from your intended market? How much is it going to cost you to get the product to market, or are they going to come to you? There's these things to think about. What produce do they want? Audrey's spoken about loads of different varieties, different produce that you could grow, but what does the customer want? If you're selling commercially, you've got to think, it's not just for yourself, it's about what the customer wants. Can you grow that produce on your land? And an important thing to consider is how often do they want it? Is it weekly? Is it fortnightly? Is it just ad hoc? And for how many weeks of the growing season? Another thing to consider is seasonality of produce. Can you meet regular orders? Generally, if you're selling business to business, so hotels, restaurants, businesses want year-round supply with increased demand during the summer months or the peak tourism season, depending on where you're based. So I'm talking here about getting bigger and upscaling. If you can't fulfill orders, then perhaps where can you source from? Is there anyone locally that you could source from? How much would it cost you to source from other people? The last thing you really want to do for your own commercial reputation is to let a customer down. And then the final thing really to think about here is competition. So if you are looking to set up a commercial business, is you need to think about, who within your local area, within your region, is already operating. What are they doing? What are they pricing? Let's say it's veg boxes. What are they pricing their veg boxes at? And how can you differentiate? Business to business versus business to consumer. Okay, so business to business is where you've got an indirect relationship with the end consumer. Okay, so that's where you, as a commercial business, are selling your produce to restaurants, to cafes, hotels, who then sell it on to the end consumer. B2C, or business to consumer, is where you've got a direct relationship with the end consumer. So that's selling, via honesty boxes, veg boxes, farmers markets, and farm vending. Generally speaking, if you're selling business to consumer, it's a lot more flexible, or can be more flexible around growing seasons. There's more opportunity to form close relationships with consumers. So there's a social aspect, which is really important within rural areas. And consumers generally are interested in your story. They're interested about you, your produce, how you've started, your whole story. That's part of who you are, it's part of your brand. And with that, you can implement a premium pricing strategy that goes with it. Whereas if you're selling to businesses, they look for continuity of supply. They're looking for regular continuity of your produce. They can sometimes lack flexibility with it. So if you can't supply them, then they're going to go elsewhere because they want the produce. So that's something to think about. Businesses are generally price conscious. After all, they've got to sell on to the end consumer. So they're going to put a markup. They're going to put a percentage markup on their product. So they're constantly wanting to drive your prices down, okay? And there's diminished loyalty as well. So with diminished loyalty, if you can't supply, well, they want the product, so they'll go somewhere else. So that's something to think about as well. For farmers and crofters, in most cases, direct marketing, direct to consumers, is the favoured and more profitable way of selling produce than selling via wholesale or business to business. I'm aware I'm rattling through this, so I'm going to keep rattling on, and then if there's any questions, I'll take them at the end, Siobhan, but I'll keep pushing on because I'm aware of time. So budgeting. Before you even start a new commercial business, it's really important to understand the finances. Again, it comes back to my original question. Why are you doing this? Is it as a hobby and an interest, so the enterprise wipes its face? Then that's fine. That's absolutely fine. And, very much encourage you to do it. Or are you commercially driven to make money from it? Okay. It is possible to do both. If you were looking to do both, I would encourage you to keep it small because you don't have all the legislative factors that go with it. If you're looking to upscale though, which some of you might be, initially I'd recommend sitting down and doing a pretty basic budget to work out some rough costs and income. Establish if there are any big costs or big startup costs required. Do you need to invest in polytunnels, polycrubs? Is there anything around investment that you need to do? Grant funding is a question that often comes up, so I'll answer it now. Some crofters have benefited from the Crofting Agricultural Grant Scheme, the CAG scheme, in the past for introducing polycrubs or polytunnels. I'm not overly familiar with the ins and outs of the scheme. So if you do have any questions, I would probably tend to lean on Siobhan or some of our other colleagues around the CAG scheme. But that, if it's available, has been a very successful tool for crofters in the past. Think about ongoing costs. So things like rent and rates, if you've got staff costs, if you've got staff, even on a part-time basis, that's something to think about. Electricity, if you have a designated area for produce, then electricity is something to think about. Water, Often water is actually a hidden cost of growing crops. You know, if you're on main supply, could be metered or will be metered. If you need private water, then you might need a borehole. So there's, you know, water is quite often a hidden cost and something to think about. And then you can start to think about, you know, that's your costs, how many veg boxes we need to sell to break even. And also consider that it takes time to build up a customer base. So what I'm going to do just very quickly, and I've only done this a couple of times before, so I don't know, this could either go really well or horribly wrong. So what I thought I'd do is just prepare a very sort of basic sample budget. Now, this would be if you were scaling up quite dramatically. So I've prepared this sort of right to left, which I know is not very intuitive, but just bear with me. So the first thing I would think about, as I say, is capital investment. You know, what infrastructure do you need to start up this enterprise? Sheds, polytunnels, polycrubs, any infrastructure that may be required. I've just gone on 40,000. It could be 20,000. It could be 10,000. You know, that is something that you can just manually insert yourself. Electricity connection. For me, I've based this on, you know, if I was starting up my own business, perhaps 3,500. It could be 5, it could be 1,000. You know, it's up to you to get quotes and insert this, those into this spreadsheet. Septic tank, a borehole for private water, 8,000. I'm personally involved in a private water, the installation of a private water system at the moment, and it's costing 22,000. So, you know, 8,000 could be an underestimate. So this is the type of thing that, you know, it's just important to do your research before you start your enterprise to establish, you know, what are these startup costs and what are they likely to be specific to your area. So for example purposes, I've got a total capital investment of £56,500 if you're going to upscale quite dramatically. Depends if you've got that money in the bank. If you're lucky enough to have that money in the bank, then crack on. If you don't, then you might be able to apply for grant funding to help. Or in this case, I've based it on a loan, so securing a bank loan. So I've put this in here. If you were borrowing money from the bank, is repaying that money over a period of time. For this case, I've gone 8 years. It could be more. It could be, you know, 10 years, 20 years, whatever you want. And I've based it on 12.5% as an interest rate. Okay. Moving left, you'll see how this works in a minute. So based on this business, I've said, right, okay, if I sell, roughly speaking, 60 veg boxes per week, and I'm going to sell for 30 weeks. I'm going to sell 30 weeks in the growing season. You might not have that. It might be 20, it might be 15. You know, it's up to you. The average income per box could vary. I've gone with £18. Again, you can change these numbers. So if it was 15, that has an effect on income and profit and loss. Likewise, if you're starting out, you might be unable to get 60 veg boxes, you might only have 30. And you can see what happens to the total profit and loss. Now, this looks horrendous, okay? Now, part of the reason it looks horrendous is because of this and the capital investment required, along with the repayment. Obviously, if that repayment is not required, you can just change that to 0. Change that there, automatically changes. There's so many variable factors within this. It's really just, you know, it's a bit like you change one thing and it does something else. So it's really up to you and your own personal circumstances, the type of produce that you're selling, and your own situation. What I'm trying to illustrate here is effectively you need to sell a lot of produce to break even. And importantly, if you are looking to sell commercially, are you able to draw an income from it? So I've based that on 18,000. If you were doing this, yes, I know that, you know, as Audrey says, you know, you can, as many crofters wear multiple hats, they've got multiple income streams, and that is a great thing to do. But I'm basing this on this exercise, this specific exercise, if you were doing this yourselves. Again, you change that, and that's the effect. So anyway, budgeting is a good thing to do. You can sit and fiddle with numbers all day, but it's something to think about. Don't work for nothing though, okay? Value your time. Farmers, crofters are very good at working for free, are very good at supporting one another, and that's all great. But if you are looking to do it commercially, is think, right, am I actually making money from this? If that is your goal, stick to it, okay? Be strong with it, okay? When budgeting, if it's a commercial business, then people often say to me, oh, how much should I budget? If I'm going to pay someone, or how much should I take? Well, that's up to the individual. But what I generally say is, if you're budgeting for budgeting purposes for a commercial business, how much would you have to pay someone else to run the business on your behalf? So for example, if something happened to you that you were unable to run the business, or you had to take time out of the business, but the business still had to keep operating, how much would you have to pay someone else to do that job for you? Is usually, well, for me, is a good sort of baseline to go from. Okay, last thing to talk about. I'm aware I've gone slightly over, so I'll speed up a wee bit towards the end. Community supported agriculture schemes, for me, is a great way to sell produce directly to consumers. Community supported agriculture schemes is a subscription-based model, connecting growers, farmers with local consumers in a mutually beneficial partnership. So most commonly in the UK and in Scotland, CSA is based on subscriptions where members or subscribers commit to a seasonal or annual subscription with a local farm. They pay an upfront fee, or they pay in installments for the produce. Cash flow is often a challenge for small producers. Therefore, the benefit of this is that the businesses get financial support up front, which helps the farm cover operational costs, buying seeds, compost, paying any staff, and it also mitigates some of the risks associated with growing and producing crops. In return, members receive regular shares of the farm's harvest, or the crofts harvest, through either a weekly or fortnightly box scheme. So it usually consists of fresh produce, what's available at that time of year. It can vary depending on what is seasonally available, and it really promotes a strong connection between consumers and the local agricultural or crofting cycles. And generally, from my experiences, as members or subscribers feel much more bought into the farm's values, whether it's, supporting agricultural practices, biodiversity, organic, whatever it is that farm's looking to achieve, is they're much more bought into those values and want to support the farm going forward. So a couple of examples, good examples. There's two great examples I've got tonight. Eastnook Market Garden in Fife. They're around a 4-acre site and have around 75 weekly CSA customers. There's lots of information on the website. And we also, a couple of years ago, we produced a case study video with Tom and Connie. I'm not going to play it tonight. You can check this out later. It's about a 6-minute video, and it goes into everything about CSA, the produce they grow, the opportunities and the challenges growing in that part of the world. And finally, Tom the Ha Market Garden is based in Comrie Croft in Perthshire. Similar size, 5 acres, growing flowers, fruit and veg to subscribers via their veg share scheme. So yes, really in summary, to conclude, think about what you're aiming to achieve. If you're small, if you're growing for yourself, your family and your friends, or an honesty box at the end of the farm road, go for it. It's a great opportunity. It's generally easier and there's less legislative requirements. If you do want to scale up, then you will need to think about everything I've just been talking about for the past 25 minutes. Food safety regulations, registering as a business, considering the finances, and also think that it takes time to build up a loyal customer base. And I'll stop there. Thank you. And I'll hand back to Siobhan.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Calum. Lots of good points there. It's really important that if people are scaling up, that they cost it and they think about their market, because yeah, what local hotels say they'll buy and what they actually buy are usually two different things. I have a couple of questions here. So someone's asking, if you have an honesty box and a local person comes and helps out a couple of times a week, so they're a volunteer, would they have to comply with all the health and safety regs?
So my understanding is the answer is no. Okay, so if you're producing on a very small scale, and it's direct, so if it's direct sales at the end of the farm road or the croft road, direct to consumers, where consumers come to your croft, and there's a direct relationship, you don't need to comply with the health and safety and all the regulations. It's only if you were to upscale significantly, selling commercially and selling regularly, and by regularly, weekly, fortnightly, outward, is then you would need to think about the environmental health side of things. Okay. Good question, though.
That's great. And then what if you're selling plants rather than veg produce? So say at a market or at the gate, are there health and safety requirements, for example, for selling seedling food plants or herbs?
Good question.
Does that mean you don't know the answer?
And it's actually a question because a question I don't know the answer to, because it's seedlings. You can't actually eat it. I don't know, Audrey, do you have any experience of that?
No, I don't. Well, not in a legal sense, no. And I know quite a few people who are selling young plant seedlings and non-edibles as well, like young trees, for example. I wasn't aware of any health and safety requirements, and I'm pretty certain that these people are not taking account of that. But I'm not. It's not my area of expertise, so I'm not sure whether they're doing it wrong or not.
My general feeling, so this is just a feeling, right? Don't hold me to this. If it's small and it's non-edible, is to me there isn't really any requirements. A lot of what I've been discussing in the past sort of half hour or so is, if you're upscaling dramatically, okay, so you're going from selling, ad hoc some fruit and veg when it's available at the end of the farm road, to right, we're going to upscale, we're going to have 4 or 5 polytunnels, we're going to have a designated veg box area, we're going to introduce our hand washing area, we're going to introduce cold storage, all these things. That's when you would need to contact environmental health and you would need to come out. If it's small scale, I don't think there is a requirement, but I would certainly encourage you, if you've got any queries, is just, as I say, contact your local authority and just ask them the question. Whenever I've contacted them, they've been very helpful. So yeah.
So Sarah has put in a comment that you need a plant passport if you're selling plants commercially at farmers markets or more than 8 miles from the growing area. So that's good to know. Okay, that's grand. There were a couple of other questions that were in, but what I'll do, Audrey, is I will ask you them and I will email the people, because I'm conscious it's now 9 o'clock. And there's going to be a recording of this available as well. So if you do have any more questions, you can continue to put them in the chat, or you can email us directly or contact the Farm Advisory Service helpline, and we'll get back to you. But thank you very much for spending your evening with us, and I hope it was useful. And thank you very much, Audrey and Calum.